What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video about D&D and the OGL in what is likely to be my final video on the subject, as Dungeons & Dragons has fully reversed course as of yesterday on their planned updates to the OGL. Now, having done a couple of videos prior about this, I wanted to sort of wrap this up and talk about what that means, the fallout from it, what we're likely to see in the future, that kind of stuff, just to kind of put a bow on this before I get back to my usual stuff. In the previous videos, I covered how Dungeons & Dragons plan to make changes to the OGL, which is the license that they use to publish a lot of the more general stuff around Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, which allowed all sorts of third-party content creators to make content around 5th edition, and the changes D&D were wanting to make to this would have effectively killed all of the third-party content for it, as it would have required insane royalty fees and handing over all rights to their work to Wizards of the Coast. So naturally, the backlash was immediate and pretty intense. I also did a video about Paizo, D&D's biggest competitor, with their Pathfinder series, and how they responded to this with their new upcoming ORC license, or ORC, that sets out to do much the same thing that the OGL did. But with that basic setup out of the way, let's talk about the sort of about face that we saw from D&D and the details therein. So for starters, they're not touching OGL 1.0a, which is generally what people refer to when they're talking about the OGL. They're not going to do anything with that at all. Now, it was rather questionable whether they could have done anything about it anyway. There was a lot of legal back and forth about whether or not the wording of the OGL, which does include the fact that it was supposed to be irrevocable, actually meant that D&D could do something like deauthorize the OGL, which according to the license, it wasn't supposed to be. And in that particular instance, had they actually made the change or update to that license, which never actually took effect, but had they done so, I imagine they would have been dealing with a court case. But as it stands, they've backed off those plans entirely. OGL 1.0a will stay untouched as it is. They are also making the entire SRD 5.1 available under a Creative Commons license. SRD 5.1 is what is published under the OGL that allows people to use the 5th edition rule set, or the basic rule set for the SRD. So the OGL is the license, and the SRD 5.1 is what was published under that license that allowed people to use the rules and everything to make the third-party content. So what D&D has done here is actually incredibly significant, because what they've done is licensed it instead under a Creative Commons license, which I'll link down below. Now, this is important because Creative Commons is a nonprofit that deals with sort of public domain and just handing off copyright in a very easy manner with these free public licenses. And it's not that they're planning to do this, it's that it's done. I'm actually going to link below as well the new Creative Commons SRD 5.1. At the same time they announced this, they also released this new licensed version of the SRD, which is not something they can revoke ever if they wanted to, because Creative Commons owns that license. And publishing the SRD under that license is something they cannot take back, which is a huge step in the right direction. And because of the wording of the license, this also clears up a lot of problems with 5th edition and things like virtual tabletops that make at least 5th edition pretty safe for third-party content going into the future. And as the biggest edition of D&D, that's a big deal. Now, D&D cites their reasoning here as their feedback for a survey they opened up after the backlash, as they were still trying to make changes, was overwhelmingly in favor of this. So their proposed changes that they were calling OGL 1.2 had a feedback survey attached, and the stats were like 90% responses of do not do this. And even more were requesting that they publish this stuff under a Creative Commons license. And it looks like that's the direction they've taken. So at a glance, this is a huge win. They finally backed off from this in what is honestly just a catastrophically bad business move. And after people were canceling all sorts of subscriptions, even pushing to boycott the upcoming D&D movie, it seems that Wizards of the Coast finally did the right thing and backed off from these proposed changes. But where do we go from here? Well, for starters, the damage is done. While I'm glad they finally reversed course, they burned a lot of bridges and they burned them very thoroughly, because trust is a fickle thing, and while they've certainly backed off from it now, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the future section here in just a second, a lot of people simply are not going to trust Wizards of the Coast and D&D to keep their word at this point, because they've proven themselves untrustworthy. And in some respects, I think the Creative Commons license will help with this, but they've absolutely discouraged people from working with them. From there, I want to talk talk a little bit about the future, but to do that, we need to understand a few things about the OGL as well as the SRD, because it's important to understand that all of this does not apply to every edition of D&D, nor does it apply to any future editions. You see, the OGL only applies if D&D is actually published under it, that is to say, that edition of D&D. When it comes to editions of D&D, 3rd edition and 5th edition were published under the OGL. 4th edition was actually published under something different called the Game System License, which was a much more restrictive version of the OGL that was hated so badly that they went right back to the OGL 1.0a with 5th edition. And then when it comes to the Creative Commons license, they're only releasing SRD 5.1 or 5th edition under that license. Now, they don't really need to release the prior versions under a Creative Commons license because realistically, OGL 1.0a is good for 3rd edition, which is the popular one. Nobody really likes 4th edition D&D, so you don't see much content for that at all. And when you start going back to like 2nd edition and 1st edition and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and everything, those are very clunky systems that are also not in use. So it's not necessarily pressing to update the language around using those things. However, what that does not include is the upcoming 1D&D, or the sort of 6th edition that they're not calling 6th edition. Because this updated version, they could very much so just choose not to publish under the OGL. And while they're abandoning their plans now, who says they aren't going to try to do this again later when everybody's calmed down a bit? Or make changes that are quieter, for instance, like releasing the new version of D&D under a different license, which also kind of sort of loops back to the fact that people don't trust them anymore. So while this statement and the changes and things we've seen here, especially the SRD under a Creative Commons license, is fantastic immediate news, it does not necessarily make me feel any better about the future in terms of potential further editions of D&D, because until they published those things under an applicable license, I would be very wary of it. And time will tell if Wizards of the Coast and D&D and Hasbro by extension actually have a vested interest in rebuilding the trust that they've burned this past month, or will they continue to be shady and release a potential future edition under a more restrictive license, though to be fair, we saw how well that worked out for 4th edition. But as it stands with the SRD 5.1 under a Creative Commons license, that will go a long way towards encouraging people like, for instance, developers behind video games into using that rule set, as the Creative Commons does allow for other types of media, which could lead to some more interesting video games that use systems like this. That said though, we still aren't done. What does this mean for Paizo and their ORC? And simply put, nothing's changed here. Paizo has already put out their own statement saying that basically they feel the need to continue doing what they're doing, which they are working on with other publishers. They expect to have a first draft up in February. And honestly, I think this is still a great option because at the end of the day, D&D burned a whole bunch of trust. Paizo has swooped in, did an insane amount of sales as a result of their announcement around the ORC license they're making. And once their license is made, they still plan on passing it off to a nonprofit, so they don't have control over it, which in the end I think is the best possible option, because this way we'll have multiple competitors working towards open gaming systems that ultimately means a better situation for everyone involved, at least as far as the consumer end of things goes. So all in all, good news. Certainly news that I'm happy to see, though I imagine everyone will keep a very wary eye on Wizards of the Coast and D&D as we move forward, because it will be very difficult for them to regain that lost trust. But as it stands, that's where we are. That's kind of the end of it. I hope you found this video informative. Certainly hope you enjoyed it as well. So if you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.